We're going to be hearing today about Brexit and the budget, what Labour should do. We've got fantastic panelists. We've got Will Hutton, who is, as you know, an author and columnist for The Observer. We have Rachel Blake, fantastic MP for the cities of London and Westminster, and the great Andy Prendergast, National Secretary of my union, the GMB. And they're all going to talk for 5 or 6 minutes and setting out their view of what Labour should do, about Brexit and the budget. And then we're going to open up to you for a question and answer session. And if you could just indicate if you'd like to ask a question, if you could use the raise hand function on the screen in front of you, that would be really helpful. That's the easiest way, and then you pop up on the side of the screen, and we can try and make sure that everybody gets in. Good. So we meet at interesting times, as always. The government has been quite effective on resetting relationship with the EU, been quite careful at the same time not to say too much about Brexit. But recently, as you're aware, Rachel Reeves has been a bit more outspoken. She said there's no doubt that the impact of Brexit has been severe and long-lasting. She's talked about the productivity challenge that we face as a result of leaving the EU, that the impact on inflation. So at the top of government, people were beginning to be a bit more challenging about the problems that Brexit has caused us. And certainly that will probably be reflected, we expect, in what's in the budget. And the evidence of the damage of Brexit keeps on coming. We just had a National Bureau of Economic Research report, and it's the latest evidence, they say, is that GDP has dropped by between 6 and 8%. Investments down between 12 and 18% where we expect it would have been. Employment, jobs are 3 to 4% fewer people in work as a result, and productivity is down by 3 to 4%. So that's what the latest gloomy but perhaps unsurprising evidence shows about the impact of Brexit. But we have the reset. We have the beginnings of talks on an agri-food deal. SPS is the jargon phrase on linking emissions trading systems. We are trying to negotiate to join the European Union's $150 billion SAFE, as it's called, defence program, a defence fund. And they're asking quite a lot of money for us to join. We're offering quite a lot less, and that's got to be sorted by the 30th of November. And there's discussions also taking place on whether you call it a youth mobility scheme or a youth experience scheme. And the Chancellor has called for an ambitious deal, which she said would be good for the economy, good for growth, and good for business, which is, I think, a lot of people will be pleased to hear. And then, of course, what's going to happen next? We have these negotiations now, but what next? What can we add to the basket of things that are discussed? The chemicals, medicines, financial services, mutual recognition of professional qualifications. How ambitious can we go? How ambitious should we go? And should we be, given the manifesto commitment not to join the single market or the customs union, or to accept freedom of movement? So I hope that sets the scene. I hope I haven't taken away too much from what our fantastic speakers are going to say. And can I invite the first of them, who is Will Hutton, to set out the stall from his perspective? Thank you. Over to you, Will.
Well, thank you, and thank you for a very good introduction. I'll be very swift and quick. Of course, the budget is primarily a fiscal event, and Treasury officials and everyone associated with it stress that actually it's about taxation, not spending. So don't expect big spending commitments or recommitments in the budget. However, I'm going to play a slightly broader canvas. I think that could be done if you wanted to do it. And I want to speak to the idea of the concept of growth. You mentioned the NBR report. I mean, I think I think that report was cited, of course, by a member of the Monetary Policy Committee in an important speech recently. And I think that it's one of the reasons why the Office of Budget Responsibility decided finally it couldn't carry on with its assumptions that trend productivity growth were 1.25%, 1.3%, and has lowered them to 1%. And that was the kind of clincher argument. So, one of the reasons why the growth projection and some of the options facing the Chancellor as they are is that any shadow of doubt, the consequence of Brexit, every single person on the call will kind of recognize that. The question is, how do we kind of, having Humpty Dumpty has fallen off the wall, how do we put him back together again? And here's just a couple of ideas from me, which I think could have been and may yet be kind of in the budget. And I think MPs on the call will have a better fix on this than me. But from the outside looking in, it seems to me possible, rising to highly probable, that there will be a leadership challenge either in January or in July of next year. And I'm sure the European question will be kind of absolutely have one of the 3, 4, 5 central issues that the government will be charged with going far too slowly and too cautiously on this. However, that's, well, I'll park that. I don't want the call to be about that particularly. So here I go on reflections on growth. I think, and Mario Draghi has floated this idea in a speech kind of last month, that actually the way that Europe's going to have to proceed is really going hard on variable geometry. And that David Miliband picked this up in his lecture on Sunday night, which you may have read an extract of in The Observer, that actually that variable geometry is actually part of the way he thinks one's going to get into the ordering of the world. There's no world order, liberal world order to be established. What there is a sequence of reorderings, and actually each one will be particular and have its own coalition of states willing to kind of play ball in actually creating a semblance of an order, but in various kind of subheadings. And I think that within the European context, as Mario Draghi kind of outlined, there are two where actually Britain can and must kind of single willingness to get involved. One is in a European, in an EU innovation area, EU innovation space. In fact, he singled that out as a possibility and also suggested that countries like Switzerland and Norway would like to play ball in such a space. I think we should add our names to that list. And also, you mentioned SAFE in the introduction. I also think there's a deal to be done on defence and security. And in both these areas, the budget could and should say something on next Wednesday. For those of you who are new to this, Britain has has a number of optimistic stories to tell. I'm co-chair of the Personal Company, kind of business think tank. We produced a trilogy of reports on growth. We call them the Growth Trilogy. You'll find them on our website. And in report 2 and report 3, we established that some extraordinary data on high-tech scale-ups in the nomenclature of venture capitalists and the world of data gatherers in this universe. A cult is a high-growth company founded within the last 20 years that's now got $25 million of turnover and is growing rapidly. A thoroughbred is one with turnover between $100 million and $1 billion. And a unicorn is a company whose valuation in its last share flotation, issuance of shares, not publicly but privately, was over $1 billion. Britain boasts 2/5 of the high-growth companies, i.e., cults, thoroughbreds, and unicorns in Europe, 2/5, more than France and Germany combined. We have the third biggest venture capital industry in the world and the biggest in Europe by country mile. The government has tentatively and begun kind of building on this. The British Business Bank has been given £1 billion a year extra to invest in the equity of scale-ups, and under a deal that Rachel led, called the Sterling 20, 20 pension funds and insurance companies, importantly including the Pension Protection Fund, which I think is a really interesting initiative, have agreed to put up to £50 billion over the next 5 years into international and UK kind of private markets, earmarking at least £1 billion a year over and above private money, over and above the $1 billion of public money, kind of into our scale-ups. This begins to close an equity gap that's very large, but it will absolutely kind of begin the process, which needs to be finished off and should be turbocharged in the budget, of actually really creating not just a big venture capital industry in Europe, but the biggest venture capital industry, and also with lots and lots of UK money
That's good. That's great. Will, that's absolutely great news and a great idea. If I stop you there, just because I'm going to.
The second one is an EU defence bond. Britain should issue a defence bond to give it the wherewithal to play its part seriously in SAFE. So those are two things I'd like to see in the budget.
Brilliant. Okay, well that's really
An
brilliant.
EU
Get us going.
An EU innovation area, and and kind of getting involved in the EU security. Sorry, I took longer.
Innovation, space, and security, and that's brilliant. And what I'll do is, that really starts things off well with some great ideas on the table. I'll bring in Rachel, then Andy, and then I hope we can come back and worry away at all that in the questions. So thank you very much indeed. Rachel, MP for City of London, Westminster, would you like to give your perspective on Brexit, the budget, what Labour should do?
Sure. Thank you. Thanks very much, Ben. And it's great to see so many of you here this evening. I'm Rachel Blake, Member of Parliament for Cities of London and Westminster, and keen member and supporter of the Labour Movement for Europe. I wanted to just reflect on the scale of recognition about the damage that Brexit has done to our economy now, and then focus particularly in on a youth experience scheme, which I have been supporting with a number of colleagues, and which I'm really pleased to see as a key part of the government's new approach to our stronger partnership with the European Union. In terms of the recognition of the harm that Brexit's done, I think that's reflected in the seriousness of the negotiations that are now taking place in terms of agri-foods, and also the phytosanitary approach that we're taking. And I think that's a really significant change that we've seen, and change that has come forward quite significantly over the last few months. It's a topic that I've been consistently talking about as a Member of Parliament, but I think that commitment to those talks is really significant. And then just in terms specifically of the youth experience scheme, I've been supporting this with a number of different MPs and raise the topic particularly in Parliament, highlighting the benefits across the whole country for young people in constituencies up and down the country to both have the experience of mobility themselves in terms of working in Europe, and also the positive impact that would have for them as individuals, but also for our economy in the current terms, in terms of contribution to the economy, but also in the longer term in terms of the skills that they will develop and the contribution that makes to the economy, and the relationships that they will develop into the longer term with organisations, companies, and skilled organisations in Europe. And I think that's that confidence in moving forward with an ambitious youth experience scheme is really essential in terms of our ongoing negotiations. And I really want to see that continue to be at the centre of our positive discussions with the EU. Back to you, Ben.
Gosh.
That was great. Very pithy and very clear and ambitious, which I think what we like to hear. Thank you very much, Rachel. That's brilliant. Andy, can I ask you to give your perspective on the world, perhaps from you or from the GMB's point of view, on what they should do around the budget and Brexit?
Well, look, thanks, Ben. And it's always interesting to talk about the EU. And one of the slightly strange things is, ever since the vote took place, we as a union have had a very clear position that we're not going to rerun it because of how divisive it is. And it's actually the other day I just suddenly hit me that the idea that somehow that since the Brexit vote we've come together in some kind of feeling of national unity, and that we could be divided anymore is frankly for the birds. But I think when we're looking at it, it is one of those ones which, as we've seen, is doing long-term damage. And the real worry for us is that this long-term damage is not accepted by everyone. And I think one of the reasons for this is because Brexit, like many things, does not have the control experiment. And, frankly, we see it on the other side. If you listen to the likes of Farage, if you listen to Reform, there is no real acceptance that the problem was Brexit. The problem was very much about the execution of Brexit. And it reminds me always of how I imagine it was like dealing with the Russian communists in the 1940s. The issue was never the idea, it was always the execution. And so I think where we are at the moment, what we've seen in the government in the last year is some positive steps to re-engagement. They've been long overdue. And frankly, in some areas, we need those to bed in. And I think the budget is an opportunity to look at these further and see where there are opportunities. I think, Rachel's point about youth mobility is quite key. We have agreements already with countries like Australia, Canada, even Uruguay, Japan, and South Korea. And we need those to be rolled out in Europe. And I think it's important with this that one of the problems we're looking at is basically we're looking at 1 year visas, not necessarily 4, and only on one country. And if you look at a lot of the areas where we need skills, which is real opportunities for members of my union, which is overwhelmingly a blue collar union, we're talking about people doing welding apprentices, we're talking about people doing construction. And what concerns us is this is the debate on the youth mobility scheme is often about, middle class kids doing the Erasmus stuff, when actually there's a real opportunity of starting to deal with some of our own skills deficits on this. And if you look at like the impact on construction, if you look at the impact on shipbuilding, this is an opportunity to train a lot more welders, getting them a lot of skills. Talking about shipbuilding, I think Will mentioned the defence side of things. We think that there is a role on the EU 150 billion safe defence scheme. I think that has some real opportunities, but we would say that we want to make sure that shipbuilding is kept out of that. Shipbuilding takes part in large parts of the UK. They are very much left behind leave voting areas. And I think if we're going to do those areas any degree of justice, we need to make sure that places like Barrow continue to get that investment, continue to get that regeneration as we rebuild our fleet. And sadly, I think most of us had hoped that the days of having to invest in warships as opposed to ploughshares were long over. But the reality is it's not. And I think we need to use one of the few, advantages or a few benefits from Brexit to actually make sure that we don't put everything up to competition and we are investing in our kids and our future. There are some other areas I think we need to look at, the chemical sector. We're continuing to call for the Swiss-style regulatory alignment with the EU. This is a problem that has cost the industry billions. We have effectively had to reinvent the wheel to come up with a very, very similar standard process, a similar accreditation. And what always worries us slightly on this is there does seem to be a moral issue that, frankly, if we can't sell something to our biggest market, then is it right we're selling it to other parts of the world? Serious questions should be asked. If we're selling chemicals, we can't sell in Germany or France, but we're happy to sell in Africa or South America. We have to ask the questions as to whether that's right or not. And I think in other areas, what we need to see is we need to see that greater investment, and we need to see a lot of the sort of red tape slowly being removed. One of the fascinating things I think for us around the whole Brexit debate was so often people talking about, the rules and the regulations. And this was something we heard all the time. And what was fascinating is how rarely anyone could actually quote a rule or regulation. And so the reality is we're not going to go back into Europe anytime soon. But that market is going to be absolutely key for us. It's one of the big areas where when we're looking at the current economy, when we're looking at the turbulence in the world, Europe should offer a bit of a safe port. Now, part of my job as National Secretary, I have to speak to big investors, I have to speak to people with billions of pounds, often looking to put real jobs in the UK. And while it was fascinating hearing from Will, I'm going to be quite honest, I don't see the future of Britain's economic prosperity going into venture capital. If anything, I think venture capital has done significantly more damage to this country than it has done any benefit. What we want to see is not venture capital and various things. We want to see real jobs in real places delivering for people. And I think that's the best way of us delivering this prosperity. And I'm not saying that venture capital doesn't deliver some jobs, but too often it comes at a significant cost of asset stripping. It comes at a cost of taking money out and ultimately offshoring, which we've now seen for 40, 50 years as this country's been hollowed out. So I think there are real benefits. I think we need to look at some of the policies that we talked about. Some of the areas on ones I haven't mentioned is the emissions trading scheme with greater alignment, some of the CBAM things that are coming in as we deal with climate change. But there are going to be opportunities, and I think the budget is an opportunity to get some of that realignment and to keep pushing back for that greater cooperation we've seen. Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Andy. That's really covered a lot of ground there. And touching on, I think it's very particularly interesting when you talked about SHAPE, the defence, European Defence Fund, excluding shipbuilding, and almost talking to a Brexit benefit there. but anyway, we'll presumably come back to that. Now, what would be great is if I could see some comments popping up on the some comments popping up on the side by participants. But best thing would be is if we could actually have people asking questions direct. And if you could put your hand up, I'd be very happy to call you. That'd be great. But in the chat, I should just draw attention to the fact that we have a link to the National Bureau of Economic Research's report on the impact of Brexit. And we also have a link to reports by Will Hutton's organization, The Purposeful Company. So if either of you, if you want to get either links on either of those, that would be great. I've got other comments in the chat. I just wonder if people would like to, however, start off by putting up their hands, be bold and actually speak to us all.
I could.
Okay. Oh, yes, I see. I've got some. Yeah, I've got some people there. That's good. I thought we were going to get on. Okay. Well, then that's great. Thank you very much, Richard, and then Michael.
Right. Good evening. My name's Richard Brinton. I'm a member of Labour International, and I'm calling in from France. I think someone mentioned earlier that the Chancellor has mentioned that a youth mobility scheme will be exchange scheme will be good for young workers, good for the economy, good for growth, and good for business. Many more personalities in the Labour Party are talking about the damage of Brexit. There is one other interesting thing that happened in the summer. After about 3 or 4 years of negotiation, the British government organised Gibraltar's entry into the Schengen area. This resolved many problems for businesses in Gibraltar, for residents, key issues to do with trade. Wouldn't this also be extremely valuable for Britain if Britain were part of the Schengen area?
Okay.
Would this not be good for growth, which is the prime consideration of the government, and what's good for under 30-year-olds of mobility and experience would be good for the whole population as well, and for business, for travel.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Richard. That's good. Will, what do you think?
Look, I mean, I completely agree with everybody who wants to, Erasmus, youth mobility. I think it's, really important, and it was really important in building kind of knowledge of fellow Europeans, their culture, and kind of developing a kind of European consciousness. And so fundamentally for it. And I agree that it's actually, it contributes to growth. However, the one I want to make, just to pick up on kind of Andy's points, is that actually, brutally, that what's going to really important for growth is getting into the customs union, the single market. And we have to find a way of doing that. And that's why I'm keen on developing the notion of an EU innovation area and an EU defense area. Because in both those areas, the scope for kind of mutual recognition, actually some mobility of workforces, and actually it's where the Europeans recognize that actually we've got something to offer that they want. And that's always a kind of good way to start a negotiation. So, and I just want to draw a distinction between private equity, which is often grouped with venture capital. Private equity are, if you like, they're value strippers, they're asset strippers, they are financial engineers, they're many of the things that Andy said about their kind of behavior in the economy is correct. Venture capital are business builders, and they've built in the last 10 years 770 growth companies, which are 2/5 of Europe's growth stock. And they are the companies of tomorrow. They are the wealth generators of tomorrow. And actually, kind of people like Mario Draghi admire what we've done and want some of the action. And actually, we need to we have two jewels really, with lots of jewels actually, but we've got two that they want. One is the contribution we can make to defence, and the contribution we can make to innovation. Two areas where the Europeans know that kind of 2 and 2 makes 5, and actually opens up the scope for it's a bridgehead for my money. If we can get an EU innovation area and an EU defence area in which there's mutual recognition, common rules and regulations for the way in which defence companies might operate, interoperability in defence, similar kind of agreements in the innovation space, we're off and running, and we're taking a giant step, congruent actually with Labour's manifesto commitments, to getting towards the single market and the customs union, and demonstrating to the British that there are great wins alongside freedom of movement, or a youth experience area, however you want to call that, that actually we can sell the British public. And also, by the way, address some of our deficiencies in productivity. And actually, my sign-off comment is this: there is no economic growth, Andy, in my view, without a critical mass of consequential growth companies operating at the frontiers of technology. That's not yesterday, that's tomorrow. And we have the capacity in Britain to have those companies. Britain could create, in the next 15 years, a £1 trillion tech economy, second only to the economies of the United States and China, and the dominant tech economy in Europe. That is a thing to do, and that creates all kinds of spin-offs, wealth, jobs, productivity, high wages, and opportunities, particularly actually in Britain's region. So I'm very anxious to separate the depredations of private equity from the possibilities of venture capital.
Good. That's very helpful. I'm going to see you and Andy, I think, are having a chat through this. I'm going to bring Andy straight back in and then ask Rachel if she'd like to comment. Andy, you've got the original question from Richard, and then you've got a little bit of a challenge from Will.
Yeah, well, I mean, just coming back on Will, and I think, that's a fair challenge on the difference between sort of private equity and venture capital. And look, and I think any economy like Britain, we have to do what we have to do well. I think the problem that we have had for quite a long time is we have very much focused on kind of financial services, white collar. And when you look at the Brexit result, it was a result of fundamentally not taking huge parts of the economy with us. And I think one of the big issues we look, particularly if you look at green industries, renewables, we're very good at coming out with the IP, we're very good at coming out with the ideas. What we're not translating that into is good blue collar jobs in the parts of the country that desperately need them. And I think one of the most fascinating statistics I heard a little while ago is 52% of people in this country live within 20 miles of where they did when they were 14. That's a very similar figure to the what we're talking about in terms of the vote for Brexit. And I think fundamentally people in Britain want a choice of localism. They want a choice about being able to have jobs, good jobs locally. We're dominated by what we call as post-industrial areas, post-mining areas in this country. And then some of those mining areas have got grandparents who were never alive when those mines were there. So we need to have that investment in terms of decent jobs for normal people. And that's what I was talking about, shipbuilding. It's what we're talking about, if we build the hydrogen economy, stuff like that. And to be fair, the party are putting some good investments in that hopefully will be delivered. I think the wider Schengen one, look, this is one that's a difficult question. I think on one level, there's a clear economic argument for it, and we're not denying it. I think the one slight difficulty, and just being absolutely honest, is this is one of the things that unfortunately a majority of people voted against. And I think we have to be quite careful about how we deal with some of these issues, particularly with a division in the country and stoking that we're dealing with. So I'm not saying on this one there's a particularly easy answer, and without wanting to dodge the question, we don't have a clear policy on it. So I am actually going to dodge the question as it happens.
That's very fair. So you're entitled to do that. I'm going to bring Rachel in. Rachel, do you want to take the question head on?
I'll sort of take Andy's foundation and be generous and take away his definition of dodging and just address the political challenge that we have in terms of that's not something Schengen is not something that there is, I think, a broad acceptance of, and what that would mean. It wasn't in our manifesto, but what we have talked about, and it is something that I think is very much within the expectations of a trade barrier, bringing down trade barriers and a stronger partnership and having a mature and stronger working relationship with Europe, is about making sure that we are having those more effective ongoing trade conversations. And I think that's how we have to acknowledge both where we got to with Brexit, the division within the country, and what we do have a clear mandate for.
That's helpful. Yes, that's points well made. I've got 3 hands up that I can see. I think what I might do, I might be brave. I'm going to, because of the time that we have ahead of us, I'm going to take all 3 questions. So also, if you wouldn't, panelists get scribbling to try and note them all down. And in the order,
there's stuff in there about Erasmus that I think.
I want to come back to.
Okay, yeah, you'll come back to that.
I come back to that. I just want to get the questions. People have raised their hands, and I asked them to, and I think that'd be good. And I'll come back to trying to pull together some things from the chat at the end. But when we've had this round, just trying to within the time. Simon, please come.
Hi Ben. We actually met a couple of weeks ago in Berlin at an event at the British Embassy, which I want to pick up on a point that Andy made about youth exchanges. I think he's absolutely right. The event we were at was an organisation which is very much white middle class professionals, and I think we need, through youth mobility, youth exchanges, not just youth but older people exchange as well. Since Brexit, we need to really encourage industrial placements. We need to encourage apprenticeship placements for people, giving opportunity for people in the northern seats of England, especially, that have no contact with the EU. It's not taught in schools. I think we need to give the opportunity to understand what our partnerships with the Europeans are about, and I think that would be very much welcome across the board. At the moment, exchanges, things like civic exchanges, town twinnings, are still for people who are largely already in that sphere already. That's the first point. Very quickly, a second point, which might be more for Will. Germany is having discussions about it. France is having a rethink on it. Rachel Reeves seems to have ruled it out. Wealth tax. Are we going to get one? I doubt it at this budget, but I think it's worthwhile pursuing. And finally, very quickly, the longer we go on with the polls like they are, the nearer to an election, will we be looking seriously at going back to the customs union before it's too late?
Right. Wow. 3 questions in one. Okay, that's great. I'm still going to say to my thing. Thank you very much. It's great, Simon. It's good to see you again. Ben, would you like to add your question, and then I'm going to bring people back in?
Thanks, Ben. Good to see you again, and good to see Rachel again. My question, well, I had a question about wealth tax, but Simon's beat me to that. But I guess it follows on nicely from what Simon said, in that I think a lot of what we talked about has been quite sort of white collar, quite removed. And I'm thinking, during a sort of Brexit campaign, you had towns where the leisure centre was built with EU funding, or the town centre, and people still voted to leave. So my question really is, how do we give people a stake in a closer relationship with the EU? I'm thinking particularly, we've talked about sort of youth mobility, but I'm thinking particularly of SMEs, many of whom have just stopped trading with the EU because of the paperwork and shipping costs, etc. And is there potential there that if we, for the budget, to make things easier from SMEs so that trade can resume?
Okay, brilliant.
Thanks,
Thank you very much. So we've got Simon asking about needing industrial placements as part of Erasmus. Will, what do you think of the wealth tax, return to the customs union, and how do we give people a stake, as asked Ben, closer relationship with the EU? Will?
Gosh, lots of questions there. I mean,
yeah.
on the wealth tax, I mean, I'm looking, wealth as a share of GDP has doubled from 1980 to 2025, from 3.5 times GDP to 7 times GDP. And yet the revenue from kind of wealth, and broadly defined, into the exchequer has actually remained stable, or actually fractionally down. So there's an overwhelming case to kind of put that right. The open question is whether a levy of 1% of assets over 10 million and pounds and then more on a scale is the right way to go about it, or whether one wants to build on the existing taxes on wealth. So, and I'm in the latter camp. I'm in favour of. I think that that there should be major reform on lifetime gifts. So that I think that a recipient of a lifetime of gifts over some threshold of, say, I don't know, 5,000 per year or whatever it might, whatever you want to pitch the threshold, should have to declare it as part of their income. And I hope that may be in the budget. I'm hoping it may be in the budget. I know that Torsten Bell was an advocate of that when he was at the Resolution Foundation. I think there's a strong case for increasing capital gains tax. There's a strong case for, really serious inheritance tax on transfers of wealth between the generations. I mean, I would build on existing and proven taxes on wealth than actually embarking on a kind of a wealth tax, where the only country in Europe that has managed to make it stick and work is Holland, where they have a tax on imputed wealth. But again, in order to do that, they've actually abandoned inheritance tax. And I'm not entirely sure that they're actually ahead in actually taxing wealth as a result. So that's my view on wealth tax. And I know there's no question about it. We have to tax the wealthy higher. The question is how to do it, not whether to do it. I've also got thoughts on some of the other questions as well, but you may want others to come in.
Yeah, no, that's very reasonable. Yeah, I will bring in Andy. Particularly, we've got the idea of the industrial placements that got an echo as part of Erasmus.
Yeah, well, and I think Simon's absolutely right on that. And I think too often the debate in this country is framed by, an awful lot of people who have white collar university backgrounds, and that's what they put forward. And it's one of these things we've been pushing for a long time. And, part of the argument is the apprenticeship scheme. This was it was actually a very rare policy that the Tories brought in that was quite a good policy that they completely buggered up in terms of the implementation, because the idea was to support apprenticeships. And in fact, what they did is they completely devalued apprenticeships by creating a new set of apprenticeships, which really had no value and no ticket. And one of the ones that really hit that for me was a friend of mine. He got an apprenticeship at BMW in Oxford and was sent to Germany as part of that. It was an excellent apprenticeship. Bizarrely, actually didn't qualify under the apprenticeship scheme. But I think there is that opportunity for, when we look at the industrial needs of the country, there's lots of great engineering companies, there's lots of great, industrial giants in Europe. And if we could harness those and give those real opportunities to our youth, then that would make a real difference. I mean, just on sort of following up the question as well on taxation, which I think is a really important one. One of the things I think that gets lost sometimes in taxation is the way that the pie has been cut. So people talk about at the moment we are in a very high tax position. Well, you go back historically, in the 70s, the top rate of tax was 83%. The top rate of tax on unearned income was 98%. At the point before the poll tax came in, the actual amount that was the top rate of rates was £10,000 a year. And that's not adjusted for inflation. So what we've seen about taxation over the last 30, 40 years is while taxation across the board has gone up, those in the broader shoulders, his tax bills have gone down significantly. And as Will says, when they are the people who have gained to a huge extent, even looking at not particularly a scientific metric, but a combined wealth of the Sunday Times rich list, that's gone off the stratosphere. So I think we have to identify a way of, as we've struggled as a nation to pay the bills, as we're dealing with more cost, we have to look at where the money has gone, and ultimately we have to direct that against some of the people who really are in a significantly better tax position than they have been for generations.
Thank you. I mean, Rachel, I wonder if I could bring you in obviously on anything you want to answer, but I was going to say particularly how we give perhaps people stake in particularly small businesses and a closer relationship with the EU.
So sorry that you're not asking me to define a wealth tax.
I thought I'd let you off, but if you'd like to, I'd be very happy.
That was the question I was particularly looking forward to, but I was just going to say that I think it's absolutely the last thing that anybody needs is a member of parliament making up taxes at this point. But I wanted to come back actually on and reflect a bit on the politics that Andy is raising, and just feedback on a debate that we had, particularly about the youth mobility scheme that the the Member of Parliament for Boston and Skegness, and the Member of Parliament for, who is Richard Tice, and the Member of Parliament for South Holland, who is, I think, Sir John Hayes. And what I was very struck by was the lack of recognition about how powerful an industrial youth experience scheme could be, and a lack of recognition about the real benefits across a number of different types of industry and types of sector, and how important that knowledge sharing, industrial knowledge sharing could be for our economy and our overall skills base. So, and I think that we need it. We do. Someone referred to education and talking about some of those different benefits, but I was very struck that the representatives of those places that are broadly actually agricultural, but with some industrial workforce as well, were not able to recognise the really positive benefits of the scheme. In terms of small businesses and making it easier for small businesses to trade, I think that is already part of trade talks and negotiations at this point, and it's certainly something to keep making the case on, so that small businesses can look to, because it's one of the things that they report back so much at the moment as being a real barrier to trade, and a barrier for them going forward.
Brilliant, thank you. Thanks very much. Well, I'm going to take a couple more questions. Pick John and then Mark. John.
It's a question and observation on the emission trading scheme and the first reset, which seems to be going at glacial pace. So if we look at the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is part of the emission trading scheme, it is important that UK industry does not have to pay CBAM. It will cost, I think Energy UK have said, about 800 million a year. Now, there is still no agreement on CBAM, despite the fact that the bureaucratic process of registering for CBAM started in March this year and will come into force in January next year. Now, we keep on having assurances from the UK government that all is well, but there needs to be a little bit more publicity. And just one question on how far will the harmonisation or the linking of the emission trading scheme go? Because the EU emission trading scheme is worth about 30 billion euros between 2021 and 2030, and funds the EU Innovation Fund. Our emission trading scheme just goes to the Treasury. So the logical conclusion is for us to join the Innovation Fund, but I wonder whether that's on the agenda at all.
Oh, goodness, very good question. Very challenging question. We're going to take that right after we hear from Mark. Thank you very much for that, John. Mark.
Thank you. My question is mainly for Will, although the rest of the panel might have ideas about it as well. I've been reading Will's inspirational book, This Time No Mistakes, in which one of the recurring themes is the way that he very impressively makes the case for much more public investment over the long term. Looking at the Chancellor's fiscal rules, which has been so happy to inherit from the ailing Conservative Party, there's this rule that the public investment may be financed by borrowing, by increased borrowing, but the current expenditure must not. Now, it's encouraging to see that some of the capital investment which we need is now happening. Where I live, for example, in Shrewsbury, there's a startling amount of construction work now going on at long last at the local hospital, which desperately needs it. I think there's 63 new beds being created, 2 new wards, and so on and so on. But when I go around the site as a patient and look up at these buildings, I wonder who's going to be inside them besides patients. Because the obvious point is that the buildings are going to need, presumably, more consumables, more nurses, more doctors. And by most people's definitions, the salaries of doctors and nurses are current expenditure, not capital expenditure. So I'm worried that we're going to be getting closer and closer to the next election and finding that capital expenditure is bearing fruit up to a point, but the capital is being underused or used very inefficiently because of an ongoing shortage of labour and other resources to go with it, or because the Chancellor may be sticking too rigidly
Right.
to her fiscal rules.
Okay.
Would Will and others agree with my interpretation of that?
Will, should we start with that and then come to the emissions trading? Is
Great.
the rules too tight?
Yeah, look, some wonderful observations and questions being made.
Yeah.
One sentence on something Andy said earlier on, which I think is very important that everyone should bear in mind. I do think that given the current climate, it's quite tricky promoting freedom of movement, even so kind of going. We have to tread carefully while keeping the long-term aim in kind of mind. Is my view there. I want to make a point too about SMEs, which have come up a number of times. This is the reason why I am so enthusiastic about or I advocate rather. I'm enthusiastically ardently advocate us trying to promote the notion of an EU innovation area and an EU defence area, because in both those areas you can slipstream the kind of a subset of the single market, if you like, and a subset of the customs union within those headings. And you can get a lot of SMEs who are suffering at the moment kind of access to European markets they wouldn't otherwise have had, as well as kind of, and our counterparties in the European Union will be kind of keen, I think, to talk about that and play ball with us. Kind of on that observation about capital investment, look, you're very, very, very well observed point. I mean, the best thing about the fiscal rules, which I criticized in my column last week, actually, is that they do give you the right, and Rachel Reeves has exploited it, to kind of borrow much more for capital investment. So, for the remainder of this parliament, we have capital investment running at 2.8, 2.9% of GDP, which is for a sustained level, which is the highest it's been since the 60s, actually. That's quite a thing. And I'd like to see more of that done in the budget, actually. Question, does it mean current expenditure moving in its wake? And the answer is plainly yes. And you have kind of done well to kind of point that out. Some of the investment, of course, can be kind of productivity enhancing. So there's not kind of one-to-one relationship between kind of the way capital was deployed in the last 10 years and the need for people. But in the hospital sector, I suspect you're right. And here again, you have an opening for kind of making the kind of European case, but in a subset of the whole. I mean, I think that the way we're going to progress the European argument in Britain kind of in the next 5 years is actually, a win on emissions trading, a win on innovation, a win on defence, a win in the health in the hospital sector, in actually getting nurses and doctors, a kind of single market, if you like, for moving to people in this area to supplement the capital investment we're making. This is the way I would play it, kind of, and building block follows building block until finally kind of you're in a position to say, well, actually, kind of de facto kind of single market and customs union rules are applying to, more than half of GDP. And then you can let's make the final leap, folks.
Yeah.
That's
very good. Yeah, well, thank you very much for that. We're coming. I'm going to ask Andy and then Rachel to come in and be quite tight because we're running out of time. And I just want to say I appreciate everyone putting the comments that they have in the chat. And they're not all questions, thank goodness. There's quite a lot of chat going on within the chat. People want to see it, but I think we've addressed the questions that were in there earlier. Andy, what about?
Well, look, I mean, I think the key question, and knowing what short time frame we've got, we're in exceptional times, and I think agreements to spending commitments were made at a point where we didn't realise quite what exceptional times we're in. You know, in terms of international volatility, it's off the scale. I think in terms of traditional alliances, we're in a world of moving tariffs, of shifting sands, and I think we have to react accordingly. So I think the Chancellor does have to look at whether those fiscal rules are right under this current arrangement, and we have to look at possibly the EU being the one reliable partner we have moving forward, where we actually can have those long-term agreements without them suddenly being changed on the whim of a president, which is very much the case on the other side of the Atlantic.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Rachel, your final thoughts on those questions.
My final thoughts are going to be really optimistic in terms of maintaining and building on. I've just been reading through some of the chat and about a generation that is internationalist in its outlook, and building on the hopes for the UK EU summit next year, how we do have some progress, although not as fast as I'm sure we would like, on the carbon border adjustment mechanism, but we have got an agreement for the mandate for that now in order to move forward with negotiating. And I think that the opportunities there as well around energy trading and our relationships there are really crucial going forward.
Brilliant. Thank you all. Thank you all very much. I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to take any more questions because we're just at the end of our allotted time. It's like all good parties. You should leave. You should be having to leave wanting more. So I'm really, really grateful to our three fantastic panelists, Will Hutton, Andy Prendergast, and Rachel Blake. If I can add one tiny little thing from myself, I think we cannot be too ambitious given the scale of the confrontation economically that's facing us. Obviously, the swiftest route to growth is to reduce the Brexit barriers. And Nigel Farage seems to be quite quiet about this at the moment, so maybe we should be less frightened of him than we have been. I just spent 2 days with MEPs who visited Parliament as part of the Parliamentary Partnership Assembly, and what's clear to me is not only that they would welcome some more ambition, but also, quite honestly, we need to be a bit clearer to them that we understand the pain that we've put them through if we want to get a hearing. Because while we're thinking about what we want more, we're going to have to think at some point about what they're really prepared to negotiate with us, and how we can get them to turn away after 8 years when they've sort of done with us, how we can get them to turn their attention back to us when they're dealing with Putin and Trump and all those other issues. But defense is probably one of our strongest cards to play there. Anyway, a few final rambling comments. I really appreciate all of you turning up, the comments in the chat, the great questions, and just the fact that Labour Movement for Europe has got such good people who really do care, and we'll get there, folks. One day we'll get back there, or we'll get there anyway. Lovely to see you all. I'm going to close the meeting now. Thank you very much.